listen. So I would like to introduce our speaker, and that is Bud Jeffries, Colonel Lewis Bud Jeffries. As a young boy growing up in Radford, Bud spent hours watching the Norfolk and Western trains thunder past. But he left Radford when he grew up, and he left for a career in the United States Army, rising to the rank of colonel. But his fascination with the Norfolk and Western Railway has never ended. He is the author of an amazing book, N&W Giants of Steam, which is regarded as the encyclopedia of Norfolk and Western steam locomotive design, engineering, and tractive power. Jeffries is a longtime member of the Norfolk and Western Historical Society and the Roanoke chapter of the National Railway Historical Society, and I am proud to claim him as a cousin. I love it being in the South. You know, you don't have to be all that close to be a cousin, so it works out. But thank you for being with us. This is going to be a treat. Thank you.
Thank you, Cousin Fran. Thank you all for being here and all the people in Zoom. This was my first experience being recorded on a Zoom session. So it's a learning experience for me as well as for you. But anyhow, I just want to say that the subject that I'm doing, I spent a long time in the military, started reading World War II primarily when I was in high school. And then I went in the Army and I studied a lot more about World War II then, to include mobilization. But then 47 years ago, I started researching about the Norfolk and Western Railway and trying to document what it accomplished here in headquarters in Roanoke. And the headquarters of Norfolk and Western was in Roanoke, so that's the reason why the presentation is called Roanoke's Railroad and the War. So I've taken together both my study of World War II and also my love of the Norfolk and Western to put this presentation together, which I first did about 3 years ago. And it's a fascinating story. And I will say that it's going to be rather complex. I'm going to go through a lot of different bits of information. If any of you here present have a question, I would suggest you ask it then, because we're going to be going on to something else. I know those that are watching this through Zoom, there's a way to give questions at the end. I'll try to address those. So anyhow, Roanoke's Railroad and the War. I think the first thing we need to do is look at what was happening prior to World War II. In the wars in between, years between the wars, in 1929, the Great Depression occurred. And America was plunged into a very deep depression. And between 1923 and 1941, the rail industry spent about $10 billion in improvements and modernization. And this came in very handy for the railroads, of what you will see in this presentation. The Norfolk and Western was noted for hauling coal. It was a highly profitable railroad and was a coal hauling railroad that was probably one of the best prepared, if not the best prepared railroad to enter World War II. And of this country's railroads, the Norfolk Western was only one. So therefore, I'm going to talk a little bit about the effect of the railroad industry during World War II. The Norfolk and Western, this picture depicts what the Norfolk and Western represented. Hauling coal. You see that about 80% of the coal, 80% of the all freight cars that the railroad owned was for hauling coal, such as these you see in this picture. A heavy duty railroad, double track between Columbus, Ohio and Norfolk, Virginia. And one side basically had trains going in one direction, the other side coming back the other way. And so you had a heavy structure to haul this heavy commodity, bridges, signals, and all that. And at the center of the pride of the railroad and its profitability was the locomotives that designed and built in the Roanoke shops. This is a heavy freight locomotive primarily used in the mountains. This is a 1938 picture of 2131, the day before it left the Roanoke shops to go in service. This locomotive was immensely successful. And even though only 10 were then in existence when the war began, it would play a significant role later. An example of the $10 billion spent on modernization, the 1206, one of the locomotives of the 10 that the N&W built in the 30s, went to the 1939 World's Fair, and this is it on display, showing modern locomotives and what had progressed from World War I to that time. And for out of 2 years, it was up there for about 12 months on 2 different occasions, a total of 12 months. And the third type of locomotive that was designed and built was the beautiful streamlined J like the 611, although it was the 611 itself didn't come till later. That this is the first J, number 600. On the first time it pulled the Tennessean from Bristol to Roanoke, and this is at Elliston, crossing the Roanoke River there at Elliston. A lot of difference, not many trees there in that era. Look at the day, you can't even see the railroad when you are there, but that was the streamline J. Well, there was a pride in building these locomotives, and when World War II started and the war was declared, the Norfolk and Westerns in December of 41, the 4th locomotive, number 603, was to be completed about the 1st of January of 42, and the workmen worked on this locomotive and presented it to the railway on Christmas Eve and put a wreath. They went out and bought a wreath and put on the front of it to say this is their locomotive is now ready to serve its country, and that was the picture of that engine. Well, what happened. There was 2 world wars in the 20th century. In the First World War and World War I, America was involved in it from about 1917 and 18. But from 1917 to 1920, the railroads were government run. That was because that there were such a glut at the ports that the railroads were nationalized by the government. And all of them were run by the government under the United States Railway Administration. And so for about almost 4 years, or 3 years plus, the railroads were, even though they were privately owned companies, were run by the government. In World War II, all the railroads remained as privately run railroads, and then a coordinated effort achieved. And that's what the purpose of this presentation will be, to tell you what the railroads did during the war. Well, in 1939, when war started in Europe, America started preparing for war because they felt like America was going to be drawn into the conflict at some point. I'm going to touch on 4 things to kind of talk about how setting the stage for the railroads to remain in private enterprise and serve the country during World War II. First, and I'll touch on each one of these individually. First of all, the Transportation Act of 1940. This was a law, an act passed by Congress, said we need to look at what all the facets of transportation are and how can they be used to their inherent advantage, and how can they work together, and to study what the rail economy is and how all these different modes fit together and feed one another. Well, you know, I'm going to tell you that never happened today, but that did happen in 1940. The second thing is the Association of American Railroads, which was a trade organization representing the railroads of the country, made a statement, and with the railroad's blessing, of course, is that they pledged that the railroads individually and in coordination with one another and the U.S. government would meet all full demands placed on it for commerce and the needs for national defense. The Norfolk and Western, even though I showed you a picture of a locomotive being built in the 30s, in 1939 to 40, the Norfolk and Western spent over $60 million. That's a lot of money in the 1940s of modernizing and continuing modernizing and preparing for war. And in their 1941 annual report, they stated that they had met all military and civilian transportation demands. Now, after Pearl Harbor was attacked, about 10 days later, the President of the United States created an Office of Defense Transportation to coordinate all public and private transportation. A very significant thing happened, you'll see in this presentation, of the impact of the decisions they had to make and what the results of those decisions were. But the office was charged to supervise all modes of transportation and to maximize the use of each. Okay, this was the heavy freight engine east of Roanoke going down the Blue Ridge toward Montvale with a loaded coal train in 1941. By 1941, the railroad was starting to haul about the same amount of coal that it did throughout the war. But there'd be some other things that they'd be hauling that would change and increase the tonnages. Well, let's talk about the tonnages and what happened here in the buildup. In 1939, the total amount of intercity freight traffic was about 800 billion ton miles. And the railroads hauled not quite 400 billion ton miles, which accounted for about 46% of the total volume. Now, let me talk about a ton mile, what that means. If you got a ton of freight sitting on a flat car somewhere and you move it, and that's a 1 ton. If you move it 1 mile, that's a ton mile. So it's a function of weight and distance that you're having to move this. So this is going to be significant, you see, when we talk about the volume of billion ton miles. By 1941, there's over 1 trillion ton miles of freight. The railroads are hauling more than 500 billion tons, and it accounted for almost 50% of the total amount of traffic. Yet in 1944, the last full year of war before the surrender in 45, the increase was minimal, about 1.1 trillion ton miles. The railroads were hauling almost 800 billion ton miles, which was 2/3 of all volume of freight hauled was done by the railroad. And there's a reason for this, and I'll touch on it in a few minutes. In addition, and among all this freight that the railroads were hauling, over the 4-year period from about January of 42 until through August of 45, the railroads moved for the Army about 293 million tons of freight. And that equated to about 206 billion ton miles. That's about 10% of the total volume of freight moved was Army things. And I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. But it's not just hauling tanks from a factory to someplace, but this is moving military equipment and units all over the area, all over the nation. Now, this is a Class A locomotive in 1942 coming down the Blue Ridge and toward Mount Vale with a time freight. That's a merchandise train. Well, let's see what the N&W was doing in this time frame. In 1939, it was hauling. Now, this is not volume, this is actual tons, 47, almost 48 million tons of freight. That includes coal, merchandise, you name it, everything. In 1944, they were hauling over 71 million tons total. That's almost a time and a half of what they were doing in 1939. Well, the railroad hauled from about 1941 to 1944 full years, about the same amount each year. So by 1941, the railroad was starting to reach its capacity of moving coal. This is typical of what the Norfolk and Western look like. This is Dry Branch, west between Radford and Bluefield on the New River. On the right-hand side of this, you see an empty coal train, and we call a hopper train or an empty, going back to the coal fields to be refilled, going westbound. It's a double track railroad. On the eastbound track, you see time freight coming east with one of those heavy duty freight engines. Well, you got a center passenger siding here, or a center passing siding, not passenger, siding. And that way trains could enter in either direction, because you had freight trains and passenger trains, and sometimes you had to put a slow train into a passing siding to let a faster train by. But the railroad was prepared for this prior to World War II. But this just gives you an example of what the railroad looked like and how it operated. When you get into the passenger business prior to the war, in 1944, the 96 billion passenger miles, which was double of 1920. Again, a passenger gets on a train and sits there, that's one passenger. You move that passenger 1 mile, it becomes a passenger mile. Volume became a big thing, and it doubled from 1920, even though more people were hauled in 1920 than they did in 1944. the volume and the distance they were each being carried on the average was a lot more. And I'll talk about that a little bit. In the organized troop movements in World War II, there were 27.5 billion passenger miles, moving 32 million military personnel. Now, I'm talking about not military people getting on a train, a military service member who's on furlough. I'm talking about he gets on a train with, civilians and all that. That's not what we're talking about. Military units and military personnel. When the Army said, we're going to take this unit with this equipment, we're going to move you to here. And that was an organized, what do we call an organized troop movement. And there were 32 million people hauled on organized troop movements in World War II. When we talk about Camp Pickett in a few minutes, I'll give you an example of what involved in World War II and the buildup involved in this country. Well, here's a Class K1 locomotive in the Norfolk Western approaching the Ohio River near Pritchard, West Virginia, going westbound with a typical passenger train of the day. And on the Norfolk and Western, in 1939, the Norfolk and Western was hauling 1 million passengers. Not passenger miles, just numbers of passengers. However, in 1942, that had been tripled to about over 3 million, which was a 305% increase. In 1944, there was over 5 million people being moved on the Norfolk and Western. That's 5 times. But when you take the volume that they were, that's passenger miles being hauled, even though they hauled 3 times the number of passengers, it's 5 times the volume. In 1944, even though they hauled 5 times as many people as they did in 39, it was 11 times the volume. Why? Because in 1939, the average passenger rode on the Norfolk and Western was 80 miles. In 1944, the average passenger rode 168 miles on an average. So they were traveling a longer distance when they were on the train. This is a major impact on the railroad, and I'm going to talk about it, but on the railroads, we're not allowed to buy new passenger equipment. They had to use what they had available. That was mandated because the government said, we're not going to build passenger cars. We're going to build freight cars we need. So, okay, that's how they were fighting the war. You may do with what you have. This is the first Class J 600, typical train. And this is a 1945 picture, but look at it. No head-end cars, no baggage, no railway express. 13 cars, nothing but passengers. And there were so many passengers being hauled, a lot of times these had to move in 2 sections. Or one section may be only the baggage and mail and all the other stuff, and then the passengers on another. But they had to do multiple sections to handle this. And these J's, I'm going to talk about servicing now, but these locomotives were used to the hill. And I'm going to show you an example here in a few minutes, toward the end of the program, about how fast these locomotives were turned. That is, brought into a terminal, prepared for the next assignment. What was the Norfolk and Western, what was it serving during the World War II? Well, served directly by the Norfolk and Western were some military installations. Camp Lee at Petersburg. At Camp Pickett near Blackstone was also a large Army base there. And that base was about 48,000 acres, capable of holding about 48,000 people. At one time, they had 63,000 people there at one time. All these were brought in basically by the railroad. Lockwood Army Air Base near Columbus, Ohio. Now served indirectly, means that other railroads were serving this. You had Norfolk, the Port of Norfolk. You had many railroads that went into the Port of Norfolk area, but the Norfolk Western was one of the bigger ones. But again, it had installations in the Navy base and all the Navy yards and all the things down there in the Norfolk area. In both the Newport News on one side of the Hampton Roads, and of course you had Portsmouth and Norfolk on the south side of it. Camp Butner, which was near Durham, North Carolina, it was a division post, and many troops went into there, but it was served by more than the Norfolk and Western. A lot of the southern or Atlantic coastline, some of those, and then there were other installations. And primarily, these are power plants. The Buckeye Ordnance Works, which was at near Canova, West Virginia. That's where West Virginia, Kentucky, and Ohio come together. That's Canope. We've got the Radford Ordnance Work. We call it the Radford Army Ammunition Plant today. It's been called the Radford Arsenal. But in that era, when it was built, it was the Radford Ordnance Work at Peppers and Ferry and Cowan. And of course, a lot of times referred to as Radford, even though Radford's 10 miles away or whatever. Then there's the New River Works near Dublin. A lot of people today up in my neck of the woods call that the bagging plant, but that was the New River Ordnance Work, and primarily for loading and storing powders. And then there was a National Fireworks Company down near Bristol, and they made munitions, and Northwestern served them directly on what they call the Bristol line. Well, see this map here, I'll try to walk you through it, and for those of you that are joining us by Zoom, I'll try to make it as easy as possible for you. But the railroad basically went from Columbus, Ohio, up in the upper left-hand corner down to Norfolk. That was the main thoroughfare for the Norfolk and Western Railway. Norfolk anchored the East End. West about 50 some miles is Petersburg, and that's where Camp Lee was located. You got Burkeville there, which is near Crewe, but just east of there was Blackstone, and that green spots there, it's partially highlighted in Burkeville is where Camp Pickett was located. And then you come back here through Roanoke and go to Walton. And you see here is two green splotches there. One is the Radford Ordnance Work, another one was the New River Ordnance Work at Dublin. And then at Bristol, down here in the lower left-hand corner of the system was where the National Fireworks Company was located. Then Canope, up you see on the Ohio River there. And then you had Columbus is where Lockland Army Base. So the Norfolk and Western, and then Durham, south of Lynchburg is where Camp Button was located. So the Norfolk and Western had a strategic importance of supplying installations, but also the port of Norfolk. Well, the Shenandoah Valley line. This is the line that goes from Roanoke up to Shenandoah. Some major changes occurred in the traffic flows during the war. And this is the primary example of it, and what occurred as a result of it. Now, in 1943, the freight volume in ton miles was about 6 times what it had been in 39. In 1939, and before the war, the Shenandoah Valley line was basically a single track railroad. It had some signaling capability, but it was basically a slow moving railroad, not hauling a lot of tons, and relatively speaking, more merchandise freight. And they had to make major improvements in 1943 to accommodate the 6 times the freight volume. Well, here's this map again of the Norfolk and Western system. And the highlighted part shows Roanoke to Hagerstown. With the improvements made on this is 238 miles, folks, from Roanoke to Hagerstown. They actually extended traffic control. This is a way to allow trains to run, and through signals can indicate for a train to either proceed or stop. They double tracked Lofton Hill, which is between near Buena Vista, and between Buena Vista, Virginia, and Waynesboro is Lofton, and that was a bottleneck. It's the highest point on the railroad between Roanoke, and they had to double track that, and they had to provide signaling and also extra passing sidings to allow more traffic to proceed on this railroad. Well, while we got this map up here, this is a time to talk about what happened to traffic flows, what caused them. When you look at in World War II, you had different modes of transportation. In World War II, trucks were reduced by and highway truck hauling cargo was reduced by about 25% because of gasoline and tire rationing. Pipelines doubled after 1943. Inland waters, like going up the Mississippi River and the Ohio River and all these, they stayed about the same. Coastal and intercoastal traffic was reduced by 75%. And the other modes had to absorb that. And the railroads were the ones that primarily absorbed all of that. And the reason is all this stuff was going down to Norfolk and putting coal on barges and whatever and moving it up to the Northeast, or bringing oil out of the Gulf of Mexico around up the East Coast to fuel the industry along the eastern seaboard. All that had to be diverted. And the reason why it was diverted, two reasons primarily. One is the need for overseas shipping. So ocean-going vessels, it was felt was not needed to move traffic. They needed for overseas shipment because we were having a lot of commitments to do things overseas, hauling men, hauling material, resupplying units and whatever. And the other was because of the German submarine menace of sinking ships along the eastern seaboard. So they said, okay, the Office of Defense Transportation, that I told you about the president created, made a decision that about the only thing left was the intercoastal waterway. Ocean-going stuff was diverted to everything else on it, and the railroads ended up absorbing a tremendous amount of that freight traffic. So that kind of gives you in a nutshell of why this occurred. Well, by the war's end, the Shenandoah Valley Line was hauling 8 times what it had in 1939, but it was primarily coal that was being diverted on the Shenandoah Valley Line to send it up to the Northeast to where the industries are located, and not take it down and ship it by, coastal shipping and all that going up the coast. So that was done, and that was over 300,000 loads of coal was diverted to the Shenandoah Valley Line, and that was equivalent to more than 4,700 60-car trains that was typical of that era. That's the reason why the Shenandoah Valley Line was changed. Also, there was petroleum trains. Now, I mentioned that petroleum was refined and gathered at the ports along the Gulf of Mexico, and they go around the Keys of Florida and up the East Coast. All that got diverted, and there was 160,000 rail tank cars that were pooled and put in service and used all over the United States. This happened to be the Shenandoah Valley Line with a heavy freight engine towing nothing but solid tank cars filled with petroleum or petroleum products. So they didn't have to use the ocean to do that. This is another heavy freight engine right here in Roanoke, getting ready to haul empty cars back through Bristol, back to the Gulf Coast to be refilled. There were 60-some routes, 66 is one source said, routes all over the country that became where these oil trains or petroleum trains were moved. But on the Norfolk and Western, it started at Bristol, bringing loaded in here, Bristol down in the lower left of your screen, through Roanoke and either up the Shenandoah Valley Line or east to Norfolk, hauling petroleum. There's a lot of petroleum used in ships and all that. So all this one couldn't be done by pipeline, had to be brought in by rail. Okay, military freight. I mentioned before that the total military freight moved by the railroad, of the total move, 90% of it went by rail. 293 million tons. It was about 206 billion ton miles. Troop movements, 97% of all troops moved in organized troop movements was by rail. 32 million were moved by rail. It was a total of 33 million. So only 1 million went by other means other than rail. That's a statistic I've shown you before. Landon Greg was here in this audience, and he gave me this picture. That's a picture from the Association of American Railroads showing light tanks being moved. This is military freight that was being moved by the Army. You can see containers on flat cars. We don't know what's in that. This happened to be a picture that was in, excuse me, this is a picture, I believe it's in New York State somewhere. So it's one in Norfolk and Western, but this was the kind of stuff that was being moved that the Army was, contracting with the railroads to move it. This happens to be a Norfolk and Western picture, although the Association of American Railroads produced it. They blotted out the name, Norfolk and Western, but I've seen the picture that has Norfolk and Western. This is at Camp Lee at Petersburg, loading troops, just about the time the war started. Okay, let's talk about these organized troop movements and what happened. Remember I mentioned before, the beginning in 42, no new passenger equipment could be purchased by the railroads. But the government did come to the rescue of the railroads in one way. They created troop sleepers and kitchen cars to help augment the railroad. And these were government owned and government operated. And now they were in a pool service. Now let's talk about each of these. First of all, there was 2,400 troop sleepers and 800 kitchen cars. This is the troop sleeper. And this is a Pullman porter. Each car had a Pullman porter assigned to it. And he's wiping the rails, handrails, and stand on the steps, you know, how you got up in the car. That was a modified box car, which 2,400 were built during the war. And inside, and the design of these things, they were about 53 feet long. There were 10 bunks, 3 high, so they could haul 30 people. 29 soldiers and 1 Pullman porter occupied those. The Pullman porter rode with his car, and he took care of the soldiers in there. This is a picture. This is actually 2 pictures. On the left-hand side shows the cars. This is the upper bunk, the lower bunk, and the center bunk is folded down to create a cushion so 3 soldiers could sit on that during the day. On the right-hand side shows the middle bunk has been raised in position, and the Pullman porter made a bed for each soldier each day, and those sheets were changed every day that they rode that train. Look where the rifles are. Hung right beside the soldier by where he was going to sleep. So that's how they created these, to give you some relief, so that the passenger cars that were before that were being used to haul troops could now be used to haul civilians, because of tire rationing and gas rationing, people couldn't use an automobile. And therefore, they had to use railroads. This is the troop kitchen car. And again, it's the same basic boxcar configuration or design, but it was modified, and it had in there 2 coal-fired stoves, cooking stoves. It had sinks, cabinets, working space, you know, meat cutting tables, refrigerator, overhead cabinets, and places to store utensils, bread locker, whatever, with hot and cold running water. This is the inside of one. This is the bread locker on the left. You see the 2 ranges side by side in there, and then to the right would be but all of these were, before they had these cars, the railroad had to get a baggage car and then have the Army put field rangers in it and cook in it. And then when they got to the next station, they had to tear the car apart and use the rangers with the unit. So they came to the aid of the railroads so they could use baggage cars for other things other than just tying them up as kitchen cars. This is a Class A locomotive that I talked about. 10 of them built before the war. And this is at Salem, Virginia, as it's coming through with a troop train. Well, the troop train there is about 16 cars, and it has 2 kitchen cars in the center. Each car could feed about 250 people. So this train had about 500 troops on it. And the train may originate in Texas and end up in Virginia. So the people would be on the train for a number of days before they got here. Well, let's talk about Camp Pickett now. There's 1 Army division at Camp Pickett. I'm going to pick on the 3rd Armored Division that went there in November of 1942. Took 52 special trains to bring that division into Camp Pickett. Each train was 24 to 42 cars. So over a period, and the division was about 15,000 people and about 1,000 vehicles. So this was a highly orchestrated affair doing this. And this division was coming from California. So they had to ride from Southern California all the way across the country to be delivered to Camp Pickett, Virginia. Well, what was the reason why I'm moving all these? Well, first of all, this is another type of, showed you a troop train before. Now this is an organized movement. It's got troops in the head end cars, that is right behind the locomotive. Then you had a kitchen car, and behind it were flat cars with equipment on it, either tanks, artillery, wheeled vehicles, whatever. So this is how they hauled their equipment. This was an organized troop movement with the equipment part of it. And why the soldiers ride with equipment? It took the soldiers to operate the equipment to get it on and off the train. They had to carry them with their equipment. Yes, ma'am.
One of the unstreamlined J classes?
That's correct. This is an unstreamlined J that was built during the war and later was streamlined, and behind it was a class K2 double heading. But, you know, they didn't have enough A's, class A's or 1200s to do it. They had to put two others together to do the same work. Good point. The question was, for those that were not here at the presentation, is that an unstreamlined J? And it was. This is the cadre of the 80th Infantry Division, you know, either loading or unloading, I don't know which, at Camp Forest, Tennessee, Tullahoma, Tennessee, June of '42. And this happens to be a Southern cars here, and that was what served that post. But anyhow, this is what happened when they bring troops in. I saw one document that said that to move a division, it took about 1,300 cars and took about 65 trains. It was typical. Now, when you're moving like the 3rd Armored Division from Southern California and all the way across the country to Virginia, it takes a lot of work. And this is prior to the computers. That was by a telephone call and a stubby pencil and a legal pad about how a lot of this worked, organizing this to get it there. They also had to be timed so that they didn't have to sit and wait. You know, they basically go from Southern California. When they got near, you know, to Crew or someplace, that the railroad then put a different engine on it and sent it into Fort Pickett or Camp Pickett for it to be, you know, to be unloaded, loaded, get it out of the way so they could bring another train, but it was timed. So all this was a highly orchestrated affair, trying to get all these trains in there. And it took a lot of time. There were 7 divisions that went through Camp Pickett. And after the last division deployed in the fall of 1944, Camp Pickett was converted into a large hospital. And I was at Virginia Military Institute as an ROTC instructor in the mid-70s. And I went down there because at VMI Corps did a field training exercise. And I went down there and had all these wooden buildings in World War II, and they had all these covered walkways between them. I thought, gosh, I've never seen anything like this before. Well, until I did this presentation 3 years ago when I did research, it became a field hospital, and it made it so you could take wounded soldiers that were there convalescing and move them from one building to the next and not be affected by weather. And of course, the railroad had to operate specially operating hospital trains, bringing the soldiers in, and it operated through the war, primarily coming from Europe. A lot of soldiers were brought in there to convalesce until they could be discharged from the service at the end of the war. Hampton Roads. This is where Norfolk is located. 3rd largest port in the United States. It shipped 19 million tons of material in, about 750,000 troops from Hampton Roads during the war years. Not all from the Norfolk and Western, because like I said, you had the C&O and other railroads on the north side, Pennsylvania Railroad even, had the Virginian and Norfolk and Western and other railroads coming in through Portsmouth and Norfolk. The Norfolk and Western Railway had a number of freight terminals there. And at Lambert's Point was a freight terminal in which it was leased to the Navy, Marine Corps, and the Coast Guard for their use. Sewell's Point had a freight terminal there, and that's not, the Virginian also had a coal terminal, but the Norfolk and Western owned a freight terminal, and that was leased to the Army and the Navy. And then one of the coal areas with a coal pier at Lambert's Point for the Norfolk and Western leased to the U.S. Maritime Commission. This happens to be the Sewell's Point freight terminal that was leased to the military forces to use in the ships there and loading, but you had rail service coming into it and hauling heavy things. And at one of these installations, I can't remember which one it is, I think it may have been this one, there was a slip, that's where they put a ship in, where they loaded ordnance and explosive stuff. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Talking about explosives, here it is. In 1942, they hauled not quite 200,000 tons of explosive ordnance. 43, it was over 300,000 tons. And there was more than 900,000 tons, an increase of about 5 times from 1942 and 1944. One of the problems you had with this is what do you do with this stuff when it starts coming into ports? Early on, the railroad had to bring it into the Norfolk Yard, which is surrounded with a civilian population. You got cars that are highly explosive that you're trying to protect and keep it from sabotage and all that sort of thing. And how you do that? Well, they ended up building a special yard at Windsor, Virginia, which is 33 miles west of Norfolk. And you pass Windsor on 460 if you're going between Petersburg and Suffolk. Anyhow, they had a yard there that was, had 8 tracks, about 5-6 miles of track on it, and it stored loaded explosives. And that way they had an isolated yard. They could isolate and secure it and prevent sabotage. And then when they had to load the ships, the train was assembled. They go straight from that yard through Norfolk all the way to the pier and stop the train. That way they didn't have to stop and try to secure it en route. The railroad at the end that yard from May of June of 44, when it went into operation, through May of 45, had about 11,000 cars of explosives stored there at some time over the time. Guarding against sabotage, we talk about securing things. This was a requirement of the railroad. It had a special agents department in charge of security. Of course, they had to have people it's 3 different groups here. I'm talking about you had to have employees, and they were taught how to be vigilant, to report what they saw if something looked suspicious. They also were special agents in that department that were used to secure, say, engine terminals or installations, on the railroad. There were also 94 armed guards to guard things along the railroad. And this picture is a heavy freight engine crossing the New River at Radford, and there's an armed guard standing on one side. There's probably one at the other end. But they had armed guard to guard that bridge. That bridge is 760 feet long, has 6 spans. If you drop that in the New River, it'd been months before they could have replaced it. That's all your patrolling trains, all your ordnance trains from the Army depots at Dublin, troop trains bringing in. It'd been a major disruptor. So the railroad hired armed guards to protect the property in case of sabotage. Happily, there was no attempt to sabotage, and there was no ordnance exploded accidentally in all the ordnance they carried during the war. Pretty good record. Well, I talked about passengers. 5 times the number of passengers were riding the trains in 44 than they did in 39. And so the dining cars got slammed. In 42, they were serving in a dining car where you go in and order a meal, they serve you a meal, you paid. Now, this is not troop movement, so I'm talking about, regular train travel. Not quite 600,000 meals were served in 1942 from the dining cars. In 43, that was over 750,000. In 44, it was over 800,000. But in 1944, they started, because there was such a need to feed people, because they were riding 168 miles average instead of 80 by this time. They started serving sandwiches and beverages to people in their seats. I mean, they paid for it, but I mean, they were leave and having to go to the dining car. And about the same rate as happened in the first 8 months or so of World War II, because it ended in September, World War II did. So anyhow, this gives you a magnitude of what they were dealing with because of having. And they did this, a total of about 3.4 million meals were served by the dining car department during the war. That was an average of over 2,500 a day for every day of the war, or every hour of the war. For 44 months, 107 an hour. that was provided railroad. They did this with manpower shortages because the railroads were competing for manpower with armed forces. There was food shortages and then high personnel turnover on top of that. But anyhow, that was just one of the challenges that the railroads had. Now I'll talk about the servicing of locomotives. You know, with all this increased activity, you had to service locomotives. In 1942, in Roanoke, started using the new servicing procedures to faster dispatch locomotives. In 1940 and 41, it took about 3.5 hours from the time the locomotive got into a terminal to have it, get cold water and sand and have its fires cleaned and lubricated and any running repairs needed and then be ready for the next assignment. That's a long time. The old system took to do about 80 a day at Roanoke. The new system was designed to do 135 a day. This is a picture of Schaefer's Crossing at Roanoke, the engine terminal. That's the roundhouse in the background at the top of the picture. What happened is this picture that's being taken that you see here was taken from the coaling tower. That's where you got water, coal, sand, fires cleaned, and then the engine in the old system went to the roundhouse and got serviced. Under the new system, you see these two buildings here? They're called locomotive servicing buildings. The locomotives got the coal, water, sand, got the fires cleaned, immediately went into that building, and in 20 minutes, they were totally lubricated with running repairs made. If the only time they go to the roundhouse, if it's something too long to fix, or they had to, or it was due a monthly inspection, which means they had to drop the fire and test things and make sure everything was safe. This is that's the coaling tower in the background. You see where the picture made from. This is these buildings are about 30 feet wide, 150 feet long, and they were designed with an inspection pit down the center, and on either side they got all these hoses hanging down. That's all different greases and oil, some things that were used in lubricating the locomotive. The locomotive comes into the shop, and Fran, there's 2156. You are very well aware of that is because it was at the Transportation Museum when you worked there, and it had there for 5 years. But that's 2156. It comes into the shop. You see, there's two men, a supervisor, and another one there walking, inspecting the locomotive as it comes in. You can see now they're stopping and starting to work on something. There's an attendant right there. He's getting all his hoses ready, and then he starts lubricating. And the fittings on each hose only matched a fitting on the locomotive that required that particular grease or oil. The railroad advertised they could lubricate a locomotive as fast as you could change the oil in the car. So, I mean, this was a major, and the Norfolk Western was the only railroad to use this system to the end of steam. No other, and it was developed early in World War II. Well, we're back to the system of the N&W, and Roanoke was the center of the railroad. And from Roanoke, either trains came and went from or to Norfolk and back, or to Shenandoah Valley line to Hagerstown, or down to Winston-Salem and back, or to Bristol, or to Bluefield to go further points west. The Roanoke had trains coming in from 5 directions, in addition to those used in the yards in local use. So it was the center of the rail operation of the locomotives coming into the. Well, in March of 1945, it was the busiest month ever in the history of the steam era of Norfolk and Western. In 131-day month, it dispatched 3,836 locomotives, an average of 124 every day for 31 days. The busiest day ever on the railroad was the 2nd of March, 45. It dispatched 141 locomotives that day. That's one every 10 minutes, average for 24 hours. That's the reason why the railroad was able to have the productivity of hauling so much, because they could use their locomotives more than most railroads could. And they were designed with roller bearings and things to facilitate them to be turned faster. So the average that picture I showed you of the Class J. The railroad advertised that the Class J's could be turned in about 70 minutes from the time they hit the terminal to the time they were ready to go. The other freight engines were less than 2 hours, but it was about 70 minutes for a J. That's the reason why when you're hauling as many passengers as they were, locomotives come in, they were turned and made ready for the next run. Roanoke shops, 2,850 employees during World War II. Ain't 500 people in Roanoke working for the railroad anymore. 2,850. Built 47 new locomotives in 42, 43, and 44. The first was the heavy freight locomotive, 2156 again. That was the only one left out of 100 that the railroad built. And it's out at St. Louis now, back there. But there's 2156. 16 of those were built in 1942. Here's the unstreamlined J's that were left, the cowling was left off to conserve war materials and all that. But anyhow, they were streamlined a little later, like in 44. And then there was this is 1212, but the 1218 was part of this. The 25 that were built 43 and 44. There were 25 more, so the railroad ended up with 35 of these locomotives during the war. Mr. Pond that I interviewed said that was the bread and butter locomotive of the North and Western World War II use with troop trains. It could do anything well, but not one as powerful as the Y6s, one as fast as a J, but it could do everything well. It would repair 200, the Roanoke shops did 284 locomotives from other railroads during the war. They didn't have the capacity to Roanoke shops pick it up. This happens to be a locomotive from the Seaboard Airline.
I mean, he just said, trying to ask her. I don't know that that's a good idea.
It's a Chicago Northwestern locomotive, and I think it was being leased by the Atlantic Coastline. But it was done there, and that's the Roanoke shops, you know, the sign in the back. But that's from the Chicago Northwestern. It also filled 85 war orders for building things. It built about 438,000 different parts or items in the railroad. Most famous Bailey bridges. Pre-made bridges so they could be for a quick repair at different lengths. They could be put together or put in place. And then in addition, they had to repair their own 500 locomotives and, you know, about 50,000 rail cars to keep them operable for their own use. But that was during World War II, what the Roanoke shops did. The employees. The railroad had about 25,000 employees total in the system. 4,600 served armed forces. The military railway service had battalions, the shop battalions, operating battalions, and different railroads would sponsor one of these battalions. Well, the Northwestern Roanoke shops was the one that basically manned or outfitted the railway shop battalion, the 755th, and went to Europe. And so that was how the 95 of the people who served armed forces that had worked for Northwestern gave their lives. And President Jenks, who was the president of Northwestern at the end of World War II, made this statement: "The NW men who gave their lives for our country, we owe a debt of gratitude which can only be repaid by our own sustained devotion to the task of helping to preserve peace and freedom throughout the world." Well, those words ring just as good today as it did then. In supporting the war effort, the Northern Western was the first railroad of a large number of employees. 98.6% of the railroad employees bought war bonds, purchased a total of 356,000 and some, valued about $11 million to help finance the war. That was their patriotic. And I was in the military for a career, and I still got some savings bonds I hadn't cashed in yet, but I did the same thing in my career. But that was one way you helped finance the war, was get employees to you know, support the war effort that weren't in the armed forces. Okay. Now, getting back to our questions earlier on, said, well, how successful was it? Remember I said the railroads left a bad taste in their mouth being nationalized? The Norfolk Western magazine in the 1940s or 50s, I read something I thought was very interesting. The nationalizing the railroad cost the U.S. government $2 million a day, and that had to be made up for a three-year period by the taxpayers paying for that. In World War II, the railroads remaining as a private enterprise paid the U.S. government every day $3 million in taxes. Now, anybody wants to start talking about social nationalization or something, go back and look at this and think it through before you commit to it. And I don't have it on the top of my head right now. One time I took a currency calculator and figured out in today's dollars what that is, but I mean, it's a lot more than it is then, a lot more. Well, what about the Norfolk Western? What did it pay in taxes? It paid about $175 plus $1 million in taxes from all of the up to through July of 45. How much did that buy? It was enough to buy 293 B-29 bombers. The B-29 was the largest and most advanced bomber of World War II. We made somewhere between 37 and 3,900. Depends on what source you look at. But the Norfolk Western could have bought almost 300 of that. Just one railroad, one company. So this is what their contribution was. And then, well, how successful were they in the war? Well, they carried twice as much as they did in World War I. They did 1/3 less locomotives, 1/3 less passenger cars, and 1/4 less freight cars, and remained as private entities doing that. That's what the U.S. railroads and the Norfolk Western were able to accomplish in World War II. So that concludes my briefing here, and it has to do with the rails to victory. United States, while one railroads didn't shoot the war, without it, they never could have won like we did in the time we did or the way we did. So that's what the railroads did. What are your questions? Question in the back. The Virginia Railway was, the question is, what was the Virginian doing at this time? It was like all other railroads in the country. It had its share of things to be moved, and I've seen pictures of them, but they had troop trains and things that would be routed over them. If you have a train coming in from, say, out of Ohio, could have come down and go over the Virginian tracks going to Norfolk, just like parallel the NW down there, because a lot of these things were routed. And I went back and I said, how many special moves or special trains a month? It was about 2,500. So I mean, there were a lot of them everywhere, and there was enough to go around. So the Virginian also shared, but I don't have the knowledge to say what kind of tonnage they carried or how much. Now, somebody could probably get it, but I don't have that. Yes, Marshall.
When we see a coal train go through Salem today, it's going to Norfolk to be exported to Europe. During the war years and the advanced tonnage of coal, how far did that get distributed? I mean, it didn't get exported, I don't think. Did it just get distributed on the Norfolk and Western lines?
And the question is where was the coal going being hauled? Most of it being hauled for domestic use. Now, there may have been some carried overseas for use in Army camps overseas. All the Army tents had these coal-fired stoves. I mean, somewhere they had to get the coal. And some of that was part of the things being hauled. But it wasn't until the mid-50s that the export coal traffic picked up. In fact, in the modern era, post-World War II era, about 2/3 of the coal went west, 1/3 went east. Starting in the mid-50s, more coal started going east for the first time in 97 years on the Norfolk and Western because of export coal going to Norfolk and being shipped overseas. More went east than west for the first time in the rail's history. It also probably precipitated faster dieselization because coal going west basically was collected west of Bluefield more level out there. Bringing coal and going to Norfolk, had to go up the Alcorn grade to Bluefield, over the Alleghenies at Christiansburg, over the Blue Ridge to get to Lynchburg. And all that was expensive, and that precipitated, you know, the merger with the Virginia because they had easier grades and dieselization. Yes, sir.
So, did any of the smaller branches that came off of the northwestern main line, say like, because today it's like Green River Rail Trail and like the Huckleberry line and stuff, what kind of contribution did it have with, the main line?
The question is from the audience is, you know, what about the branch lines and feeder lines off the main line? How were they affected? Well, obviously, like the Durham line took a lot of the traffic going to, say, Camp Butner, going to Durham. But you got to remember, there's more than just the Army going on. Industry was reducing things, and you may have somebody who was making mess kits or whatever, you know, that was taking in tonnage. And I have a statistic, I don't have it in front of me, but how many carloads of raw materials that was hauled to make things and how many carloads of stuff that was made brought out. And you distribute that over the whole system. A lot of your branch lines, like, you know, I don't have a good example, but you know, the Galax line had a lot of furniture down there, manufacturing. They probably made field tables or something. I mean, you know, everybody had to do something that the government said, you have the expertise to make this. For example, Singer Sewing Machine Company didn't make many sewing machines during the war, but they made a lot of machine gun mechanisms. I mean, this is, they had the tooling and to be able to do all this kind of thing. So I don't have a good example for you on that, but the Bristol line was used heavy. Shenandoah Valley line, obviously. All your branch lines out in the coal fields, that was the coal bin of America. They hauled I'm thinking it was like 190 million tons of coal was hauled out of West Virginia during the war. The question is whether they thought they were hauling coal off the Huckleberry line. It is possible they hauled a load here and there, but in the 50s when I was riding the Huckleberry, they had a coal tipple there, it had a siding. Once in a while you see a car there, but practically nothing was ever being taken out. More of the traffic was going to Blacksburg, to feed stores, and that sort of thing. Back here.
Now, during the war, did Norfolk and Western give any particular security look at its own employees with German or Italian ancestry?
I've never seen anything about that. The question is, was there any effort to screen Norfolk and Western employees that maybe had German or national ethnicity from some of our war partners or warring nations that we were against? I don't know about that. Yes. Russell?
Carol had done some research, of course, military history, I think. There was mention, I believe, in our earlier about Camp Blanding, Florida. Camp Blanding at that time was so large, it was considered the third largest city in Florida. It's now headquarters for the Florida National Guard. Of course, it's much smaller. My father-in-law got drafted in June 44 from down Scott County with Camp Blanding. Doing some research, there was 2 rail lines going out of Camp Blanding. One went west up toward the Panhandle. Camp Blanding was west of Jacksonville. And there was one heading north. The troops that were selected, if they put you on the westbound train, you went to California to the Pacific. If you went on the northbound, you went to New York and to Europe. So he was put on the northbound, went up and got on the Queen Mary, which had been converted to a troop ship, and ended up, of course, at the Bulge. And so I thought that was interesting. You talk about troop movements, of course, growing up in Cambria and hearing people talk about, you know, the troop trains coming through and things like that. I just thought that was interesting about Camp Blanding it was vital to moving personnel and assets during that time.
Well, you bring up an example about Camp Blanding, Florida, and that was a big base. And I didn't know that. I haven't studied. I know people. I've talked to some World War II vets that went to Camp Blanding, but mainly as replacements. But I know that Camp Pickett, for example, one of its reasons it was selected where it was because it was relatively close to Norfolk, where you could send troops to Europe. It also had the mountains to the west, and I've read a couple of division histories where they went up, Peaks of Otter in the mountains there. They ran exercises in the west to give them training while they were, so they could go east or west for training exercises, and not just within the 48,000 acres of the fort. So there's a lot done. One thing that I want to talk about, talking about the mobilization of the armed forces. The Army in 1939, when war broke out in Europe, was about 230,000. That included Army ground forces and the Army Air Corps. In August of 1943, the Army got to its maximum size and maintained at the end of the war at 8.2 million. 6 million of that was in the Army, 2.2 million or 2.4 million actually was in the Army Air Force. So when you talk about mobilization, these divisions, for example, would pick up like the 3rd Armored Division. They do training in California and then bring it to Camp Pickett and would train there. 3 months later, they moved it to Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania, outside of Harrisburg. And a few months after that, it was deployed overseas to Italy. So what I'm getting at is the whole Army, out of 91 Army divisions in World War II, 88 were created in this country, trained and deployed overseas. 88. Only 3 were overseas, and 2 of those were created in Hawaii, and 1 was the Philippine division that the Japanese destroyed when they overran the Philippine Islands in 42. So what I'm getting at is the railroads were key to moving these troops around so that we could get them trained and get them ready to be used overseas. And I mean, it was a big deal. Yes, sir.
With the full motor coal and water and tank, how distance did they travel before they had to be resupplied?
Well, you had major. Well, the question is how far would a locomotive and a train be able to go, with coal, sand, and water that had available? Well, in World War II, you basically had a terminal at Crewe to go to Norfolk to Crewe, 120 miles, about 100 miles from Crewe back to Roanoke, another 100 miles to Bluefield, another 100 miles to Williamson, West Virginia, 112 miles from there to Portsmouth, 110 miles or something like that from Portsmouth out to Columbus, Ohio. So that kind of gave you a gauge of what they could do, but a lot of times in heavy operations, they had to stop and take on extra water. It wasn't until the 1950s they started adding what they call an auxiliary water tender, where they could add another 20,000 gallons of water and be able to go from one terminal to the next with a fully loaded train and not have to stop and take on water. And then start the train up again halfway out there. But that's the Class J's. They ran them basically over 3 districts, which was Roanoke to Bluefield to Williamson to Portsmouth. They could take on maybe water at a pasture station. They'd have a standpipe where to take on water. They didn't have to take and service it, turn it. They could go a little further. They were magnificent machines. Magnificent. Somebody else had to hand up. I'm sorry. Yes, sir.
Would you know what the average crew size for one train, whether it was freight or even troop transport, besides rail crew?
Well, I know freight trains, you had a crew of 5. You had an engineer, fireman, head end brakeman, rear end brakeman, and a conductor. Conductor was in charge of the train, but he was in the caboose. The engineer ran the train. It was outpaid what the conductor is, but the conductor was actually in charge of the train. But that's the way it worked. Now, when you get into passengers, a lot of times you had conductors and ticket agents and all that take tickets and punch them and whatever. But they had about the same. Of course, now a passenger train had dining cars, so you had a lot more. Just the operating crew was about 5.
We have a couple things on the chat as well.
Okay.
So the first is from Mike, and he wanted to share with you that a friend of his from Nebraska was in the Navy and rode the NNW to Chicago, coming home on various occasions. And then after he got out and into business, he bought stock in NNW, seeing what he got from his experiences. A question from Jim. How much material went on the NNW bound for Oak Ridge?
I don't know, and that was such a secret that nobody would know that, probably. And it's probably still a secret, all I know. My father, though, was in the American Red Cross during the war. He was too old to fight in the war, but he worked in the American Red Cross, and I've heard him say many times, when he heard that the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, he said, now I know what was going on at Oak Ridge. People knew something was going on. I've known a number of people who were there. It was an isolated, you couldn't go on leave and leave the place. You were once you were in there, I have a friend whose mother was down there. She just recently passed away in her 90s. She was down there, and the only thing her job was to turn a dial. So if you turn this dial up to 8 or whatever. But they had no idea what they were doing. I mean, other than turn a dial, they had no idea what was going on there and what they were experimenting with to develop.
So Mike said, after you finish your presentation, applause. And James says, thank you, bud. So that's all we have.
My pleasure. I think somebody on the Zoom was my Marshall's sister, my cousin, Elizabeth, is on there. I saw her on there. Anyhow,
Hey, Bud.
another question. Yes, ma'am.
I got a question. Yeah, can you hear me? Can you hear me, Bud? Yo.
And the train would come down with mountain pass, going usually very slowly by her home, going east. One day, all the cousins were out in the yard playing, and the train was going so slowly, we knew something was wrong. We suddenly heard sort of a whistle, and all these troops came pouring off the train, pouring off. It looked like hundreds of them, running for the river, which was on the other side of our home. They were not going to go to war. They were hoping to escape. I wonder if you had ever heard anything like that.
I've never heard of that. If is it Cumulus, it's on the Virginian line. I thought they were saying since it had no air conditioning on the train, they were going to get a bath. Jeff? Yeah, I didn't mention, but Camp Pickett had a lot of POWs there that they and also Camp Butner had a lot. I mean, like 5,000-6,000 were there. Yeah, mainly there during the war. I mean, not even before all the troops were deployed. They had prisoners of war there.
Prisoner of war camp in Salem, like where the State Department is today.
Okay. Yeah, the question had to do about prisoners of war, you know, and that was also something the railroad had to deal with, hauling them too, just like everything else. But the Army said, take this group of people and move them here. That's what it was.
Building portable bridges, did you say actually railroad personnel?
Yeah, the Roanoke shops, the question is about building bridges, and there was the Bailey Bridge, which was a type of bridge. It could be used, you know, as a deck bridge or girder bridge or whatever, and can be used to, you know, made them in 15-foot lengths or 25-foot lengths. So if they had a creek or something that had a accident, they could put a new bridge on it and get it in operation. It's already pre-made just to put it in place. You can use it they could use them in Europe like for crossing a anti-tank ditch, you know, for vehicles to use, not just railroads. They used them a lot, the engineers did.
Railroad personnel to build them.
Well, there's Roanoke shops had the question is, you know, what was Roanoke shops built? And they had 85 war orders, and they were making either repair parts for something, but they also made Bailey bridges, you know, I mean, completed bridges in different lengths and sizes to be used either for road or highway use as replacement bridges when they were needed in say a bombed out area or where an accident occurred. And they ship them overseas complete.
We have another question from the chat. How did the war impact the railroad's bottom line?
Well, the question is how did the railroads come out and affecting the bottom line? The Norfolk and Western came out very well. When the war was over, the modernization program that they had through the Depression, especially picked up in the mid-30s all the way up through the war, continued. And their highest year record of freight service during the war was 1944 in that time frame. They got rid of a lot of obsolete cars at the end of the war that had been, you know, worn out, obsolete locomotives. They got rid of those. Starting in 1948, they continued to build locomotives. They built, I think my figures are right, that in a 69-month period from about April of 48 until December of 53, they built 86 new locomotives in a 69-month period. And also the year 1948 was the year that they set a new record that was not broken until the late 50s as far as the amount of freight moved. And the modernization of using heavier rail, expanding traffic control, and all that sort of thing was continued after the war. So they, President Jenks, the one I quoted, he just said, we're going to leave no leaf unturned to modernize and prepare for, you know, return back to a civilian economy, not a war economy, and to be able to meet the needs and transportation with other modes coming on. He recognized that, you know, airlines was practically nothing in World War II, but now, I mean, you know, looking in the 50s, the jet airplane and the truck and all that sort of thing took over a lot of inner city traffic. And so the railroad was looking to compete with other modes of transportation and modernize as best they could.
Another one from the chat. Did the NW convert any troop sleeper cars to head-end equipment after the war?
I don't have a definitive answer on about, you know, these kitchen cars or troop sleepers being converted, but I do know that out of 2,400 of the troop sleepers, I think over half were sold to the railroads and were converted to head-end cars, maybe hauling mail, express or whatever, but they weren't used for hauling people. But then there were a lot of them. There is a figure written in, I think, Classic Trains about that I read, but I don't have it with me right now. But they were used. And I remember, you know, 3 years ago when I put all this together and I read that particular article, and I thought, oh yeah, I remember seeing you know, the Tennessean come through Radford, and they had a kind of a boxcar like thing right behind the tender. So now I witnessed it. I just wasn't aware of at the time what it was, but I think that may have been one of them. They looked very similar, but didn't have the windows on it and all that. But they were modified, but they were used. I want to say out of the 3,200 kitchen cars and troop sleepers, I think 2,100 were sold to the railroads and used after the war, and others were kept back in case of wartime need or whatever.
Well, thank you. We'll all appreciate your patience.